My ex-husband crashed my daughter's funeral, demanding her $35 million inheritance, and I sat there in that quiet church watching him stride down the aisle like he owned the place, as if 15 years of silence meant absolutely nothing the moment money entered the picture. The bastard actually had the nerve to slide into the front row beside me, whispering about our rights while my Emma lay in her casket, pale and still, flowers surrounding her in a way that felt unbearably wrong. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I'm Margaret Sullivan, and this is how I learned that some people will crawl out from under any rock for the right price. Let me paint you the picture properly. There I was, 65 years old, burying the only person who had ever truly mattered to me. When Rob Sullivan decided to make his grand entrance, 15 years, 15 long years since he walked out on us without looking back, and suddenly he was back because Emma had made something of herself without him. "Maggie," he whispered, easing into the pew, as though nothing in the world had happened between us, as though he hadn't shattered our lives. "We need to talk about Emma's estate." I turned and looked at the man I had once loved. This stranger who had abandoned his 80-year-old daughter when things got hard. His hair was gray now, cut neatly. He wore an expensive suit, perfectly tailored, and his manicured nails rested calmly on his knee. Success looked good on him, which only made me want to slap him even more. "We don't need to talk about anything, Rob," I said quietly, forcing my voice not to shake. "You gave up any rights to her when you disappeared." He leaned closer, and I caught the scent of his cologne, the same brand he had worn when we were married. Some things never change, I guess. She was my daughter too. "Maggie, I have legal standing." Legal standing. He had legal standing while I had sleepless nights nursing Emma through fever dreams when she was 9. Legal standing while I worked 2 jobs to pay for her college applications. Legal standing while I held her hand through 6 months of chemotherapy, watching leukemia steal the light from her brilliant eyes. The pastor began the eulogy then, speaking gently about Emma's kindness, her intelligence, her incredible business success at just 23 years old, worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes. My baby girl who had started coding at 12 and built her first app at 16. Rob nodded along as though he had been there for any of it, as though he had earned the right to mourn. "She built that company thinking of you. You know," he whispered during the closing hymn. "Always wondered where her old man was." That was the moment I understood that Rob Sullivan hadn't simply shown up at our daughter's funeral. He had come armed with lies, ready to rewrite history for his own benefit. But if he believed 15 years of abandonment had left me weak, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he could be. After the service, I watched him work the crowd with effortless charm, introducing himself to Emma's business partners and friends like the grieving father he had never been. The performance was flawless, and I knew right then this was going to get ugly. Emma's story had truly begun when she was 19. Sitting at the small kitchen table in our tiny apartment with a laptop older than some of her college classmates. "Mom," she had said, glancing up from lines of code I couldn't begin to understand. "I think I figured out how to fix the problem nobody else can solve." She had been obsessed with medical data security ever since I told her about the nightmare we faced. After her father left hospitals losing patient records, insurance companies denying coverage because files went missing, people dying because their medical histories vanished into digital black holes, Emma took it personally. What if medical records could be completely secure but instantly accessible to any authorized person, anywhere in the world? Her eyes had shone with possibility. What if no one ever had to suffer because their information got lost or hacked? I had smiled and made her another cup of coffee, thinking it was a sweet, idealistic dream. I was working as a hospital administrator then, seeing the same data problems she talked about every single day. The difference was that Emma believed she could fix them. 6 months later, she dropped out of college, and I nearly had a heart attack. "Mom, I got into the tech accelerator program," she had explained, practically bouncing with excitement. "They're giving me $50,000 in 3 months to build real investors want to see what I can do." "Sweetheart, you're throwing away your education for what might be a pipe dream," I had argued, terrified she was making the biggest mistake of her life. She looked at me with those serious green eyes she inherited from her grandmother and said softly, "Mom, what if it's not a pipe dream? What if this could help millions of people? What if I could make sure no family ever goes through what we went through?" That accelerator program changed everything. Emma didn't just build she revolutionized how medical data worked. By 21, Hospitals across the country were implementing her system. By 22, international health organizations were paying millions for licenses. The day Forbes called her the medical data genius who could save lives. Emma cried in my arms, not from joy, but from sheer exhaustion. Success was incredible, but it was overwhelming for someone barely old enough to drink legally. I did it for us, Mom, she whispered that night. I wanted to prove that what happened to our family mattered, that we could turn Dad's abandonment into something that helped other people. And in the end, MedScure was worth $35 million. That was what MedScure was worth when Emma got sick, $35 million. An amount that represented not only brilliant coding and sharp business acumen, but every sacrifice we had made together. Every night I had worked late to pay for her computer classes. Every single moment she had chosen to fight for something bigger than herself. And now Rob wanted his share, as if he had contributed anything beyond DNA and heartbreak. What he didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that Emma had been expecting this day long before she got sick, because my brilliant daughter had seen him coming from a mile away. The day Rob left us, Emma had been in the living room, building a blanket fort. 8 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, blissfully unaware that her entire world was about to collapse. She had invited me inside for a tea party with her stuffed animals, carefully using the good china I had been saving for special occasions. Daddy's been acting weird, she had said, pouring imaginary tea for Mr. Buttons, her teddy bear. He keeps looking at his phone and talking in whisper voices. I forced a smile, pretending everything was normal. Even though I had already found the divorce papers Rob thought he had hidden so well. Sometimes grown-ups have big feelings, sweetheart. It doesn't mean anything's wrong, but everything was wrong. Rob had been having an affair with his secretary for 6 months. Classic, right? The cheating husband, the loyal wife who didn't see it coming, the innocent child caught in the crossfire. If it hadn't been happening to me, I would have rolled my eyes at the cliché. Maggie, we need to talk, he had said when he got home that evening, his voice already distant, already gone. Emma ran to hug him, like she always did, and I watched his face carefully, searching for something: guilt, sadness, hesitation. But there was nothing except impatience to get through an unpleasant task. That was when I understood our marriage wasn't ending because he had fallen out of love with me. It was ending because he had never truly loved either of us at all. Emma, honey, go play in your room for a few minutes, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Daddy and I need to discuss some boring grown-up stuff. She skipped away, humming softly, still living in a world where parents worked things out and families stayed together. 5 minutes later, that world was gone forever. I'm leaving, Rob said without preamble, no apology. No explanation of the affair, no acknowledgement of what this would do to Emma. I filed for divorce. I'll be out by the weekend. What about Emma? I asked, though I already knew the answer from the look on his face. She'll be better off with you. Kids need stability. And Linda and I were planning to travel, build a life together. Emma would just complicate things. Complicate things. Our daughter, his flesh and blood, would complicate his new life. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him understand what he was destroying. But instead I nodded quietly and began planning how to tell an 8-year-old that her daddy was choosing someone else over her. The weekend came and went, and Rob packed his belongings with ruthless efficiency, kissed Emma's forehead as though he were heading out on a business trip, and walked out of our lives without ever looking back. Emma stood at the window for 3 hours that first night, convinced he had forgotten something and would return for it. Maybe he'll remember Mr. Buttons, she whispered. Daddy gave him to me for my birthday. But Rob never came back. No phone calls, no birthday cards, no Christmas presents, complete radio silence while I worked 2 jobs, and Emma slowly learned not to ask about her father anymore. 15 years later, there he was again, perfectly groomed and legally prepared, ready to claim his share of the fortune Emma had built while missing him every single day of her life. Some people have no shame. Then again, some people also have no idea what they're really up against. The morning after Emma's funeral, I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee that tasted like sadness when the doorbell rang, and through the peephole I saw Rob standing on my porch with a thin man in an expensive suit holding a leather briefcase. Lawyers. Of course, I took my time answering, finishing my coffee, and checking my hair in the hallway mirror. Not because I cared how I looked to Rob, but because showing up looking like death would give him ammunition. I had learned long ago that dignity was sometimes the only weapon you had. Maggie, Rob said with his polished politician smile when I opened the door, I'd like you to meet Thomas Mitchell. my attorney. We were hoping we could have a civilized conversation about Emma's estate. How civilized can we be? Rob, I asked, not inviting them in. You haven't spoken to Emma in 15 years, and now you want half her money. Thomas Mitchell stepped forward, radiating professional Polish and legal intimidation, yet something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with this case. Mrs. Sullivan, I understand this is an emotional time, but there are legitimate legal questions that need to be addressed. Mr. Sullivan maintains he has parental rights. Maintains, I repeated, catching the careful choice of wording. That's interesting phrasing for something that should be straightforward legal fact. Mitchell shifted slightly, and I saw Rob shoot him a warning look. The law regarding parental rights can be complex. We're here to discuss a reasonable settlement that avoids costly litigation. I stepped aside and let them into my living room, not because I wanted to, but because this conversation needed to happen somewhere private. And Rob's eyes drifted slowly over the modest furniture, the family photos covering every surface, the life he had walked away from without a backward glance. You've kept it exactly the same, he said, sounding genuinely surprised. Even Emma's school pictures. Why would I change it? I asked. This was our home, Emma's and mine, the home you chose to leave. Thomas Mitchell opened his briefcase, but there was a hesitation in the movement, a flicker of uncertainty. Mrs. Sullivan, before we proceed, I need to ask, are you aware of any documentation regarding Mr. Sullivan's parental status, any court orders or legal modifications? Rob's face went pale. Tom, we discussed this. My situation is complicated. What kind of complications? I asked, sensing weakness for the first time. Mitchell looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. Mr. Sullivan, I think you need to explain the situation fully. I can't represent you effectively without complete disclosure. What situation? I pressed, watching the confidence drain from Rob's face. Maggie, there were some legal proceedings years ago. When you were trying to get child support, I had to make some difficult decisions. That was when the pieces began falling into place. The way Mitchell had said maintains he has rights, instead of stating it as fact. The hesitation, the careful language, the tension humming between lawyer and client. Rob, I said quietly, what exactly did you do to avoid paying child support? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. My ex-husband hadn't just abandoned Emma emotionally. He had done something legal, something permanent, something that was about to destroy his inheritance claims completely. And his own lawyer was beginning to realize he had been lied to. I think, Thomas Mitchell said carefully as he closed his briefcase, that I need to conduct some additional research before we proceed further. Mr. Sullivan, we should discuss this privately. Rob was sweating now despite the cool morning air. Tom, I explained that the situation was complex. We can work around any complications, can we? Mitchell asked pointedly, because if there are existing court orders that terminate or modify your parental rights, that fundamentally changes the legal landscape. I watched the exchange with growing satisfaction. Rob had clearly misled his attorney about the extent of his legal problems, and now it was coming back to bite him. What court orders? I asked innocently, though I was beginning to suspect what Emma had uncovered during her illness. Mitchell looked at Rob expectantly, and when no answer came, he stood. Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to need you to provide me with complete copies of all legal proceedings related to your relationship with your daughter. All of them. After they left, with Mitchell looking increasingly unhappy, and Rob desperately trying to maintain control of a crumbling situation, I sat back in my chair and thought about Emma's final months. She had been so weak from chemotherapy, yet there were days she rallied enough to work on her laptop. I had assumed she was managing business affairs, but now I wondered if she had been doing something else entirely. My daughter had always been thorough when it came to protecting the people she loved. An hour later, the phone rang, and Victoria Chun's name appeared on the caller ID. Margaret, I saw the news coverage of Emma's funeral. Victoria's familiar voice said, I'm so sorry for your loss. Emma was extraordinary. Victoria Chen had been Emma's mentor since the early days of Medskurnot, a business partner, but something almost as valuable, a successful entrepreneur who had taken Emma under her wing and guided her through the complexities of building a tech company. Emma had spoken of her constantly, crediting her with much of Medskir's strategic success. Thank you, Victoria. Emma always spoke so highly of you. Margaret, I'm calling because Emma asked me to reach out if certain situations arose after her death. She was concerned about potential complications regarding her estate. I felt my pulse quicken. What kind of complications? The kind involving absent fathers who might suddenly develop an interest in inheritance rights. Emma was quite thorough in her preparations. She asked me to coordinate with you if such a situation developed. Coordinate how? There was a note of grim satisfaction in Victoria's voice. Emma left very specific instructions about protecting you and her legacy from opportunistic relatives. She anticipated that her father might emerge from whatever rock he'd been hiding under if her success became public knowledge. She prepared for this. Margaret, your daughter spent the last year of her life building legal and strategic defenses against exactly this scenario. She had investigators, attorneys, and evidence. She knew her father better than he knew himself. I thought of Rob's sweating face, his nervous lawyer, the obvious gaps in his story. Victoria, what exactly did Emma discover? Everything. And she made sure that if her father tried to claim inheritance rights, the full truth about his character would become public knowledge. Emma didn't just build a company, Margaret, she built a fortress around everyone she loved. That evening, sitting in Emma's old room and going through her papers, I found a sealed envelope with my name on it, and inside was a letter in her careful handwriting. Mom, if you're reading this, it means Dad showed up looking for money. Don't worry, I've handled everything. Trust Victoria, and remember, I love you more than all the money in the world. The next morning, Thomas Mitchell called with news that would change everything. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, his voice tight with professional embarrassment, I need to inform you that I'm withdrawing as Mr. Sullivan's counsel. There are ethical issues that prevent me from continuing representation. What kind of ethical issues? I asked, though in my heart I already suspected the answer. Thomas Mitchell's voice remained stiff with professional restraint as he replied that client confidentiality prevented him from discussing details, but he could say that Mr. Sullivan had not been forthcoming about crucial aspects of his legal status regarding parental rights. After he hung up, I immediately called Victoria Chen. Rob's lawyer just quit. What did Emma find? Victoria let out a sharp, almost humorless laugh. Emma had discovered that my ex-husband had legally terminated his parental rights 11 years ago to avoid paying child support, which meant he had zero legal claim to her estate. Suddenly, the timeline fell into place with painful clarity. When Emma was 12, I had hired a lawyer to pursue back child support. The case had mysteriously stalled, and I had been told something vague about changed circumstances. At the time, I had been too overwhelmed, working 2 jobs and barely keeping our lives together, to fully grasp the legal complexities. Victoria continued, her voice steady but edged with disbelief, explaining that he had chosen to legally abandon Emma to save himself $300 a month, and now he wanted to claim $35 million. The irony was breathtaking. Why didn't Emma tell me? I asked quietly. Victoria said Emma had wanted to protect me from the pain, but she had also wanted to be prepared in case he ever tried to stake a claim on her success. That afternoon, Victoria arrived at my house carrying a detailed folder of documents. Emma's investigation had been thorough, though not some elaborate spy network as I might have imagined. She had simply hired a competent private investigator and worked with estate attorneys to document Rob's abandonment. Then Victoria told me Emma had discovered something else and showed me photographs and paperwork proving that my ex-husband had a pattern of targeting women with resources and abandoning them when the money ran out. The photos showed Rob with different women over the years since leaving us. After he left me, he had lived with Carol Jenkins and her 4-year-old daughter Sarah for 3 years, and when Carol's savings were depleted, he disappeared. After that, he married Linda Morrison for her inheritance money. But the most damaging revelation was still to come. 2 years ago, Emma had tracked down Carol Jenkins, and Carol's daughter Sarah was now 16 and struggling with the same abandonment issues Emma had once faced. Victoria showed me correspondence between Emma and Carol, and I realized my daughter had been quietly helping Sarah Jenkins with college preparation and counseling, building a support network for children abandoned by the same man. Victoria explained that Emma had prepared for the possibility that Rob would challenge her estate by documenting his pattern of abandoning children, gathering evidence of financial exploitation, and assembling a comprehensive case that would destroy his credibility. The folder contained Carol Jenkins's testimony about Rob's financial abuse, documentation of his terminated parental rights, and evidence of his current financial desperation. Emma had not only protected her estate, she had constructed a case that would expose Rob's true character if he dared to challenge her wishes. Victoria then pulled out a final document and told me there was one more thing. Emma had arranged for all of this information to be released to selected journalists if Rob pursued inheritance claims, because she wanted his pattern of abandoning children to become public knowledge. In that moment, I understood the full scope of Emma's preparations. My daughter had not merely anticipated Rob's greed, she had created consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life if he tried to profit from abandoning her. The next morning, Rob called, his voice stripped of charm and thick with desperation. But Emma's plan was already in motion, and nothing could stop what was coming. "Maggie, we need to talk," he said, his voice cracking through the phone as he admitted that things had become complicated because Linda had found out about Emma and was furious he had never told her he had a daughter. "Imagine that," I replied dryly. "Your wife is upset you lied about having a child." "How shocking." He said she was threatening to leave him, claiming he had deceived her about being childless and talking about lawyers and their prenup being invalid due to misrepresentation. I could hear the panic spilling from him. His second marriage was collapsing, and from what Victoria had shown me, Linda Morrison's inheritance money was the only thing standing between Rob and total financial ruin. "Rob, what do you want from me?" I asked. He admitted he needed Emma's inheritance more than ever because Linda was cutting him off financially. His construction business was bankrupt, and he had nowhere else to turn. I told him he should have thought about that before legally terminating his parental rights, and the silence that followed was deafening. He demanded to know how I knew and who had told me, but I simply said Emma had known for years that my daughter was brilliant, and asked whether he truly believed she would not investigate the man who had abandoned her. That afternoon, Victoria and I met with Emma's estate attorney, David Washington, a thorough and careful man in his 50s who had worked closely with Emma to create ironclad protections against precisely this scenario. He explained that Emma's estate planning was comprehensive and that my ex-husband's terminated parental rights made any inheritance claim legally impossible, but she had gone further than mere legal protection. He showed us a timeline Emma had created documenting Rob's pattern of financial exploitation. After leaving us, he had systematically drained Carol Jenkins's savings before abandoning her and her daughter, and he had married Linda Morrison primarily for her trust fund, which he had been depleting through failed business ventures. David said Emma had wanted his behavior documented not only for legal protection, but also to safeguard future victims, because she believed men like my ex-husband continued their patterns until someone stopped them. The plan Emma devised was elegant in its simplicity. If Rob pursued inheritance claims, the documentation of his abandoned children and financial exploitation would become public record through court filings, and if he escalated matters with media attention or harassment, she had prepared even more devastating revelations. Emma also established a fund, Victoria added gently, to help children abandoned by absent parents. She specifically wanted Sarah Jenkins and other victims of your ex-husband's abandonment to receive educational support. That evening, my phone rang, and when I answered, it was Carol Jenkins. "Mrs. Sullivan, I wanted to thank you for what Emma did for Sarah. Your daughter reached out to us 2 years ago and has been helping with college preparation." I felt a catch in my throat. "I didn't know Emma had contacted you." Carol's voice softened as she explained that Emma had told her she understood what Sarah was going through because she had lived it herself. Emma had helped Sarah get counseling and tutoring, and she had said, "Girls who lose their fathers need other women to show them they're worth something." Speaking to Carol felt like staring into a reflection of my own past. Rob had charmed his way into her life just as he had mine, played the devoted stepfather to her daughter, slowly drained her resources, and then disappeared when the money ran out. The hardest part, Carol admitted, was explaining to a 7-year-old why the man who'd been reading her bedtime stories suddenly didn't want to see her anymore. That night, sitting alone with the weight of it all, I finally understood the true scope of Emma's legacy. She hadn't merely built a successful company. She had created a network of protection and support for women and children like us, the ones Rob Sullivan had used and discarded. And now, as he stood on the brink of financial ruin and public exposure, Rob was about to learn what it felt like to be abandoned by someone he thought he could count on. The news articles began appearing 3 days later, not because of any elaborate media conspiracy Emma had orchestrated, but through simple public records requests journalists made after Rob's bankruptcy filing mentioned potential inheritance disputes. The first headline appeared in the local business journal: "Construction company owner seeks inheritance from daughter he abandoned." Larger papers soon followed, and when Rob's new lawyer attempted to file a challenge petition, the terminated parental rights document became public record. Victoria and I sat together over coffee as she showed me the coverage. Emma hadn't needed to manipulate the press. She had only needed to ensure that when Rob made his grab for money, the truth about his character would be easily discoverable. My phone rang constantly that morning as reporters sought statements about Rob's claims. I declined interviews, but the story gained momentum on its own. Rob Sullivan, the man who had legally abandoned his 8-year-old daughter to avoid paying child support, was now seeking millions from her estate. Then Linda Morrison called me directly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Linda Morrison. I believe you knew my husband before I met him." "Yes," I replied evenly. "Rob is my ex-husband." She wasted no time. "I'm filing for divorce. I've discovered he lied to me about having children and has been systematically depleting my inheritance. I wanted you to know that I completely support your position regarding Emma's estate." I thanked her, meaning it more than she could know. Her voice hardened as she added, "Mrs. Sullivan, Rob Sullivan is a predator. He targets women with resources and bleeds them dry. I've been documenting his financial abuse for months, and I'm prepared to testify about his character if necessary." That afternoon, Rob showed up at my door unannounced. He looked awful unshaven, clothes rumpled, every trace of polish gone. "Maggie, please, the media attention is destroying what's left of my life. Linda's filed for divorce. Her lawyers have frozen our joint accounts. I'm going to lose everything." I looked at him steadily. "You lost everything that mattered 15 years ago. You just didn't realize it at the time." He insisted he had made mistakes, but Emma had still been his daughter, and he deserved something from her success. "Rob, you legally terminated your parental rights. You chose $300 a month over having a daughter. That decision has consequences." His desperation filled the room. He begged for some arrangement, some quiet settlement. "The only settlement available is the one Emma already provided," I told him. "She left detailed instructions about what should happen if you tried to claim her inheritance." I handed him a sealed envelope Victoria had prepared, containing Emma's final handwritten message to her father, written during her last weeks. "To Robert Sullivan, you terminated your legal rights to me when I was 11 years old, to avoid paying child support. You chose money over your own daughter then, and you're choosing money over her memory now. I have legally ensured you will receive exactly what you chose to give me over the past 15 years. Nothing." Rob read the letter twice, his hands trembling. "She really knew about the termination. She knew everything, Rob, about Carol Jenkins and her daughter, about your financial abuse of Linda, about every family you've destroyed chasing easy money." In that moment, he seemed to understand that he hadn't simply lost an inheritance claim. Emma's documentation of his pattern would shadow him for the rest of his life. Yet the story still wasn't finished. Emma had one final surprise to ensure he could never repeat this damage. The next morning, Carol Jenkins called again. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've been contacted by several other women who had relationships with Rob Sullivan over the years." "Other women?" I asked, stunned. She explained that my ex-husband's pattern was even more extensive than any of us had realized. Emma's private investigator had uncovered at least 4 women Rob had targeted for their financial resources before abandoning them and their children. An hour later, Victoria arrived carrying a folder of additional documentation. Emma's investigation had uncovered a trail of broken families stretching back to shortly after Rob left us. And as Victoria explained it, I realized just how meticulous my daughter had been. She hadn't only documented Rob's abandonment of Emma and Sarah Jenkins. She had identified a clear pattern of financial predation. The women's stories were disturbingly similar. Would charm his way into relationships with single mothers or women with inherited wealth, play the devoted partner, an attentive stepfather, while gradually accessing and draining their resources. And then, when the money ran out, he would vanish, leaving behind confused children who had bonded with him and could not understand why he no longer wanted them. Emma had reached out to some of these women before she died, Victoria told me, helping them understand they were not alone and connecting them with counseling and legal support. That afternoon, David Washington called with news of Rob's latest maneuver. He had hired a new attorney who was attempting to argue that the termination of his parental rights had been coerced, claiming he had been pressured into signing documents he did not understand. I asked if such an argument could possibly succeed, and David assured me it could not with the evidence Emma had compiled. The termination had been voluntary, properly witnessed, and Rob had legal representation at the time. More importantly, Emma had anticipated this exact claim. During her final month, she had recorded a clear, lucid video deposition addressing the possibility that Rob might assert his termination was invalid, carefully explaining how she discovered the documents and detailing her father's long pattern of abandoning children. She had also arranged for Carol Jenkins and the other women to provide sworn statements describing Rob's character and behavior. If he chose to challenge the termination, all of that evidence would become admissible. David explained, but Emma's masterstroke went even further. She had not only constructed a defense against Rob's claims, she had designed a counteroffensive to ensure he would face consequences for a lifetime of desertion. Emma had established a victims' advocacy fund, Victoria said, and if Rob pursued inheritance claims beyond the initial demand, that fund would finance a class action lawsuit against him on behalf of all the children he had abandoned. There was enough money set aside to pursue him legally for years. Every child he had bonded with and then walked away from could seek damages for emotional distress and the psychological harm of his desertion. Your daughter essentially created a legal trap, David observed with quiet admiration. The more aggressively Rob chased her inheritance, the more devastating the personal consequences would become. That evening, Rob's new attorney called requesting a settlement conference, and the strain in his voice suggested they had finally begun to grasp the magnitude of what Emma had prepared. Yet there was still one final revelation waiting, something that would permanently end Rob's inheritance claims and expose the deepest truths of his character to everyone who had ever trusted him. The conference was held in David Washington's office, where Rob arrived with his new lawyer, a younger man named Kevin Barnes, who looked as though he had already realized he was in over his head. Barnes began cautiously, saying his client was prepared to significantly reduce his inheritance claim in exchange for avoiding further public scrutiny. David responded evenly that Rob had no inheritance claim at all. His parental rights had been legally terminated, and that the meeting was merely a courtesy. Rob appeared haggard, wearing the same clothes from 3 days earlier, the media attention and Linda's divorce filing visibly eroding him. He turned to me, pleading that although he had made mistakes, there had to be some acknowledgement that he had been Emma's father. I told him quietly that he had been her biological father, but he had chosen not to be her parent when she needed one. Barnes then attempted a different strategy, suggesting that even if the termination stood, there might be grounds for a moral claim, arguing that Rob had contributed genetically to Emma's intelligence and abilities. Victoria, who had remained silent until then, laughed outright and asked if they were seriously suggesting Rob deserved money because Emma had inherited intelligence from the man who abandoned her to avoid $300 a month. That was when David opened Emma's final file and said there was something else to discuss. Emma's investigation had uncovered information about Rob that went beyond abandoning children for financial reasons. The room fell silent as David placed a thick stack of documents on the table and explained that Emma had discovered Rob had been using false identities and social security numbers to evade debt collectors and conceal assets from former wives. Rob turned pale, stammering denials, but David continued, describing credit applications under false names, bank accounts opened with stolen identities, and tax evasion spanning multiple states of agents of identity theft and fraud going back 12 years. Barnes looked as if he wanted to disappear, admitting it was the first he had heard of any of it. Victoria explained that Emma had anticipated she might need to reveal Rob's criminal activity to protect her mother from harassment, and she had ensured that if he continued to pursue inheritance claims, law enforcement would be drawn in. The identity fraud evidence was devastating. Rob had created false personas to obtain credit and avoid legal obligations to the families he had abandoned, and the Social Security fraud alone carried federal penalties that could mean years in prison. David stated that Emma had left explicit instructions that if her father escalated his claims beyond initial contact, this evidence should be forwarded to federal prosecutors because she wanted to ensure he could not continue victimizing women and children. Rob was trembling now, begging me not to let them proceed, promising to drop all claims and disappear if only those files were not turned over. I looked at the broken, desperate man who had once been my husband and the father of my brilliant daughter, and I told him he should have considered consequences before preying on vulnerable families for 15 years. Barnes began hurriedly packing his briefcase and informed Rob that, given these allegations, he could not continue representing him. That was when Emma's final message was revealed. A video she had recorded only days before her death, created specifically for this moment. On David's laptop screen, Her face appeared pale but unwavering, her eyes bright with determination. Dad, if you're watching this, it means you tried to claim money from the daughter you abandoned. I've documented every family you've destroyed, every child you've left, wondering why they weren't worth staying for. The legal evidence I've compiled will ensure you face consequences for your choices. But more than that, I want you to know that despite everything you did to us, Mom and I built a beautiful life. We were happy, we succeeded, and we did it all without you. The video continued, her voice steady. I'm leaving my fortune to help children abandoned by parents like you. Mom will oversee scholarships and support programs for kids who need to know they're valuable, even when their fathers walk away. That's your legacy, Dad. Not inheritance money, but proof that children can thrive without parents who choose not to love them. By the time the screen went dark, Rob was crying, the full weight of Emma's words and the consequences of his choices finally settling over him. But tears came too late. Emma had ensured that justice would follow him for whatever time he had left. 3 weeks later, Rob Sullivan stood in federal court facing charges of identity fraud, tax evasion, and Social Security fraud. Emma's documentation had been thorough enough to draw prosecutors from 3 different states, where he had created false identities to obtain credit and avoid obligations to the families he had abandoned. I sat in the gallery and watched as the man who had once promised to love and protect our family was led away in handcuffs, and beside me sat Linda Morrison, who had provided additional evidence of his financial crimes during their marriage. Emma would have been satisfied with this outcome, Linda said quietly, justice for all the children he abandoned. The judge sentenced Rob to 4 years in federal prison, followed by restitution payments to his victims. He would never again be financially secure, spending whatever remained of his life repaying the families he had destroyed. Yet Emma's true victory was never his punishment. It was the scholarship funds she had established, the counseling programs she had endowed, and the network of support she had built for abandoned children. A month later, Carol Jenkins brought her daughter Sarah to Emma's memorial service. Sarah, now 17, and headed to college with the help of Emma's scholarship, spoke about how knowing Emma had reached out to her had helped her heal. Emma showed me that being abandoned by a father doesn't mean you're not worth loving, Sarah said. She proved that children like us can build something beautiful from the broken pieces. Victoria and I continued Emma's work, expanding the foundation to reach more families scarred by parental abandonment. Emma's business success had given us resources, but her compassion had taught us how to use them. 6 months after Rob's conviction, I received a letter from him in prison, apologizing for abandoning Emma and asking for forgiveness. I read it once, then filed it away with the documents from Emma's investigation. Because some apologies arrived too late to matter. A year later, Victoria and I uncovered Emma's final secret project. She had been working with legislators to strengthen laws, protecting children from financial abandonment by parents. Her draft proposal, now known as the Emma Sullivan Child Protection Act, made it far more difficult for parents to legally abandon their children to escape financial responsibility. She knew she was dying, Victoria told me as we reviewed Emma's legislative research, but she wanted to make sure her death protected other children from what she experienced. The bill passed unanimously, and Emma's name became associated not only with technological innovation, but with legal protection for vulnerable children. I still live in the same house where she grew up, surrounded by photographs of the brilliant, compassionate woman she became despite her father's abandonment. The $35 million she left behind now funds scholarships, counseling programs, and legal advocacy for children who have been left behind. But her greatest gift was never the money. It was the proof that love, determination, and the refusal to be defined by abandonment can transform betrayal into something extraordinary. Rob Sullivan believed he could step back into our lives and claim what Emma had built. Instead, he learned that the 80-year-old girl he once walked away from had grown into a woman capable of dismantling him with documentation, precision, and the justice he had spent 15 years evading. That is who Emma Sullivan was, my daughter, who turned abandonment into armor and used her brilliant mind to protect every child who came after her. Rob Sullivan gave her life, but he never gave her love, and in the end, that made all the difference in the world. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.